Hey there, welcome back. So, if you're anything like me, you've probably read your fair share of self help books and success literature. And there's one aspect of reading books like that that inevitably gives me some grief. And I find that it's frequently the case that I run across some piece of advice in one of these books, and that seems to contradict some other piece of advice that I read in another book. And that can be frustrating because the problem is that you can't ever get out of a static book by an author who's writing for a general audience. You can never get an adequate amount of context out of it. Should I do this thing, or should I do just the exact opposite of this thing? And the answer to that question almost always is that, well, it depends. And that means it's your job to figure out what is the right direction to go in. And of course, if it's your job to figure out what the right direction to go in is, and what good did the book really do you? So, anyways, often the kind of advice that I'm talking about in these books, it comes down to some kind of pithy phrase or soundbite. And there's one particular pithy phrase I want to talk about in this video, and it goes something like this. Maybe you've heard this one before. And it says, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Oh boy, let's dig into this. By the way, sometimes to give added credence to this saying, it is variously attributed to Benjamin Franklin, Mark Twain, or Albert Einstein, even though, as far as I can tell, there's no evidence that any three of those people ever said that, and I don't believe that any of them would have been dumb enough to say such a thing. And I also should say up front that of all the pithy sayings found in self-help literature, this is the one that causes the most viscerally negative reaction to me, because it was used on me at a time in my life when the stakes were very, very high, and it was used as a way to manipulate me into making decisions that weren't in my best interest. So this particular phrase for me really brings up a lot of bad memories and regrets. But in any case, let's give this a full analysis and kind of talk about both sides of what this is trying to teach us. So let's start with a literal analysis of this saying. This is, of course, not the definition of insanity. The definition of insanity, looking it up in the dictionary, is a persistent mental order or derangement. So that's not the definition of insanity, so strike one against this pithy phrase. I don't think that's really probably wasn't meant to be taken literally like that, but still, let's move on here. If we taking a look at it a little bit more substantively, but still a little bit of a literal interpretation, I think it actually would be quite unexpected to get the same result every single time through repeated action. It'd be a little bit like saying, if I roll a set of dice, I don't expect to get the same number to come up on the dice every single time. So life is, so the starting point is never the same. That's the problem. And there is some randomness to it too. But I'm focused more on the starting point rather than the randomness. Life is constantly in flux, and very often there's a cumulative effect of sustained action that will at least eventually produce a different result. So let's take just a simple example. Let's say, for example, that you're digging a canal to connect two bodies of water that are 500 feet apart, and you dig 10 feet of trench per day. So you do the same thing over and over again every day, right? You dig 10 feet, 10 feet, 10 feet. And the first 49 days, nothing happens. But is it really insane to think that on the 50th day, when you finally complete the canal and the two bodies of water are finally connected, is it really insane to think that you won't get a different result, that water will flow between those two bodies of water? And why did that happen? And you did the same thing day after day after day, but you eventually did get a different result because you had a different starting point each day. And that's the key to it, that there's a different starting point. Life, every single situation is a different, you have a different starting point than any previous situations that you were ever at in the past. So let's put this in the context of, let's say, what I'm doing right now. I'm working on a product. Every day I write a little bit of code, day after day. Most of the time, nothing new happens. But is it really insane to think that the cumulative effect of consistently applied effort won't eventually lead to a desired outcome of having a completed product and that people will use and get value out of it? So that's strike two on this little pearl of so-called wisdom. Now let's try to be fair here and argue the other side of this a little bit. I think, this saying is probably meant to be applied to blatantly self-destructive activities that keep leading to predictably negative outcomes. So if I say to you, I see in your first marriage you went out and got drunk every weekend and came home and beat your wife, and she filed for divorce. And in your second marriage, you went out and got drunk every weekend and eventually got divorced. And now you're on your third marriage and you're still going out and getting drunk every weekend. Well, what do you think is going to happen? That's kind of what this phrase, I think, is meant to be talking about. So sure, blatantly destructive activities that lead to predictably negative outcomes are what's meant to be addressed here. Now, in the case of what I'm doing, for example, working hard to build value in the form of a software startup, it seems to me that the best course of action in a situation like that is to remain steadfast, to stay the course, to see it through to the end. But so what I've seen is that this saying is trotted out and used in situations where it's less clear that the activity is self-destructive, and it's for the person that's trotting out the saying is could be the case that they're using this saying as a way to mentally manipulate the other person. So in closing here, I see two opportunities for reflection from this saying. First, should I stay the course and keep going, or should I shift gears and try something else? And there's no right answer to that question. It's going to depend on your situation and a whole bunch of things that I won't know about for you. I'd say, for me personally, when I reflect on, the biggest failings, I think they're really rooted in not sticking with something long enough, giving up on something too early, and not sticking with it long enough to be successful. And for that reason, I would tend to favor the opposite sentiment of what this saying is trying to teach us, right? It almost feels like it's saying give up, right? Like, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Seems to be implying that you should give up on what you're doing and go do something else. But I think that as long as you're engaging in right action and you're building value into something with a cumulative effect, then I would be much more in favor of the idea of persevering and sticking with it rather than, chucking it all away and starting completely over on something else. And so for that reason, I really, don't always like the intended sentiment that's built into this, that the implication that you should try something else. So that's the first lesson. And then the second lesson is to be on guard against pithy phrases used as mental manipulation. And all self-help literature is filled with all manner of this kind of stuff. And to be frank, Stoicism isn't immune to this either. And, when I first got into Stoicism, I was a little bit, I had some of these same kind of things where I would start to say, read something and be like, oh yeah, but what about in this other situation? Shouldn't you do the opposite? So Stoicism's got its fair share of pithy sayings. But it's not the pithiness of the saying, any particular saying. It's not the pithiness that concerns me. It's the potential to use that pithy saying, either when it's used by somebody else to kind of mentally manipulate you, or if you use it on if you use it on yourself, then it's got the potential where you can kind of like start second guessing yourself, and kind of creating your own wake vortex and spinning yourself out. So be on guard against that. And that's what I have to say in this video. Thanks for listening.